Savior, say, thy strength indeed is small. Child of weakness, watch and pray. Find in me thine all in all. Jesus paid it all to him I owe. Sin had left a crimson stain, he washed it white as snow. Lord, now indeed I find thy power and thine alone can change the leper's spots and melt the heart of stone. Jesus paid it all to him I owe. Sin had left a crimson stain, he washed it white as snow. Jesus died my soul to save, and my lips shall still repeat. Jesus paid it all to him I owe. Sin had left a crimson stain, he washed it white as snow. Jesus paid it all to him I owe. Sin had left a crimson stain, he washed it white as snow. Jesus paid it all to him I owe. Sin had left a crimson stain, he washed it white as snow. Oh, well, sin had left a crimson stain, he washed it white as snow.
Scripture reading for this week is from Psalm 39. Psalm 39, read with me. I said, I will guard my ways, that I might not sin with my tongue. I will guard my mouth with a muzzle, so long as the wicked are in my presence. I was mute and silent. I held my peace to no avail, and my distress grew worse. My heart became hot within me. As I mused, the fire burned. Then I spoke with my tongue. O Lord, make me to know my end, and what is the measure of my days? Let me know how fleeting I am. Behold, you have made my days a few handbreadths. and my lifetime is as nothing before you. Surely all mankind stands as a mere breath. Surely a man goes about as a shadow. Surely for nothing they are in turmoil. Man heaps up wealth and does not know who will gather. And now, O Lord, for what do I wait? My hope is in you. Deliver me from all my transgressions. Do not make me the scorn of the fool. I am mute. I do not open my mouth, for it is you who have done it. Remove your stroke from me. I am spent by the hostility of your hand. When you discipline a man with rebukes for sin, you consume like a moth what is dear to him. Surely all mankind is a mere breath. Hear my prayer, O Lord, and give ear to my cry. Hold not your peace at my tears. For I am a sojourner with you, a guest like all my fathers. Look away from me, that I may smile again, before I depart and am no more. Now to our portion of Scripture for the week, which is mainly focused on, of all things, Leviticus 13 and 14. This actually pretty extensive section of what they call the purity codes, the holiness code in Leviticus, dealing with leprosy, which I admit is a bit of an unusual and sort of arcane section of text to be dealing with. It's actually quite fascinating in its own right, the symbolism that emerges, the procedures. The more you get into it, the more fascinating and interesting it is to dig out some of the deeper meaning, which we're going to get to. I just have a few ideas on that. But you have to emphasize at that point, it is rather speculative. You have to extract deeper meaning is a good deal of work. You have to do a good deal of symbolic interpretation. And I find it utterly fascinating. I always do when we visit the subject of purity and impurity in Leviticus, and particularly leprosy is just bizarre, so bizarre that you have to spend a good deal of time thinking it through and cross-referencing research on it. But I think there's a lot of meaning to be extracted here, actually, and so we'll get to some of that. Doubly interesting, at least I found this particularly this week in going through this section of Scripture, is it's fascinating to view the ancient conceptualization of impurity and how ancient people thought of diseases and contagion and defilement as a transmissible sort of unseen infection. It's particularly interesting to think about that now at a time when we're all hyper aware of things like quarantine and isolation and how infection spreads, things that we normally don't really think much about. There is a sort of corollary between what you're reading about in Leviticus and the way they treated somebody with an infection and how we're all sort of obsessed now with hygiene and infectious disease and contamination and the spread of diseases and how to isolate and quarantine. All of this by necessity now we're obsessed with. Well, ancient people were obsessed with it, but for different reasons. And that requires some explanation, which I don't want to get too detailed into, but the biblical leprosy that appears, and in fact, that translation is not even really, it's rather unfortunate that what's called leprosy in English Bibles got translated that way. It's really not the modern disease that we call it's now called Hansen's disease. That's historically been referred to as leprosy. It's really not much to do with that. It's possible that is one of the afflictions that's being described in Leviticus 13 and 14, but it's almost certainly not really the same medical condition. And in fact, most of what's going on in Leviticus is not dealing with a medical condition. There are obviously physical symptoms that are addressed, but most of the concern there is for ritual purity. So that's going to be really important to keep in mind. But there is a parallel to the way ancient people thought ritual impurity to be actually a contagion that can spread in an unseen way. It was an unseen contagion that sort of like a gas could spread and travel. There is a parallel to the way that we understand sort of microbial infection, pathogens to work in the microscopic, unseen, airborne spread of disease. They thought quite similarly. They just didn't know that they didn't think in terms of biochemistry or medical diseases or pathogenic spread. They just thought that defilement itself, impurity, ritual impurity, had this quality of an airborne contagion that could not make sick necessarily, but could ritually defile others. And that's the concern of a lot of Leviticus and the clean and unclean, pure and impure laws of the Torah. It's particularly interesting when you get to leprosy, what we're going to just call biblical leprosy. We can't really change the vocabulary, or I would, so we'll just call it leprosy, but you'll know what I mean. It's not exactly the same as, it's not a physical disease they're so much worried about as more of a spiritual condition that's being revealed. But it's particularly interesting to consider impurity when you get to chapter 13 and start dealing with this affliction, this skin affliction, because it's treated so much differently than it is like, say, the chapter before, where a woman who gives birth to a child has incurred a sort of impurity, and she has to undergo a period of isolation, and then she has to undergo a ritual purification process to be readmitted back into her normal, pure, clean state. But that's pretty simple, and it's not treated so severely. I mean, it's a long time. I think it's a 40-day total for a male child and 80 days for a female child. But the procedure is rather simple, and it's not treated with the same sort of severity as when you get to chapter 13, this skin disease is. So that's curious on itself. All purity is not equally troubling in Leviticus, and that's interesting and worth thinking about. So before we get to some of the actual, explication of some of the things that are going on in the text of chapter 13 and 14, let me back us up to just an overview conversation, pretty briefly, of the very idea of ritual impurity and why it's so serious and why it's considered so extensively in Leviticus. One of the ways to think about this, start thinking about this, is just to think about ancient Israel in conjunction with their pagan neighbors, right? Their bordering countries, Egypt, Mesopotamia, how these cultures also viewed impurities and had purification rituals and a whole sort of sacrificial system to deal with this stuff. This is not new to Israel. But when you read through Leviticus, one thing that scholars point out is there are several differences that pop up. One is that in Leviticus, in God's system of purity and maintaining purity and avoiding impurity, it's clear that the causes of impurity always basically seem to be human or natural, right? So childbirth is a natural occurrence, but it causes impurity. Menstruation is a natural part of a woman's physical life, but it's defiling. They're natural causes, or humans can be the cause or sort of source of their own defilements. The reason that's different from the many of Israel's neighbors is because there was a widespread view in the ancient world, in the pagan world, that impurities like this were the realm of demonic forces. They were caused by malignant supernatural evils that sort of spread like an unseen spiritual malignancy. They actually lived largely in fear of these supernatural forces. So impurity for them was not just defiling, it was dangerous because it could be evil spirits seeking to harm you. Leviticus basically strips that all away and says, no, you can be defiled through natural means, or you can be defiled through your own behavior. But God is not threatened by demonic forces that are seeking to do bad things, right? So that's a huge difference between Israelite approach to defilement and what you would have seen their neighbors dealing with. It was considered a sort of airborne pollutant, as we talked about, but it wasn't a malicious spiritual evil, like a force, a personified force that could, make its way through the camp and do harm to people just for the sake of harming people. Not that Israel didn't have a supernatural worldview, not that there weren't such evil forces working in the world. The Torah plainly tells us that there are, and the rest of the Bible certainly does. But that didn't really come to bear on the system of priestly worship and ritual purification. They weren't purifying evil spirits from the camp. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. When you see atonement offerings taking place at the altar, and as we'll look at next time, on the Day of Atonement, penetrating into to decontaminate the actual sanctuary and the Holy of Holies itself, that is a cleansing ritual not to purge out evil spirits and sort of expel demons from the presence of God's people. They are ritual procedures and offerings to cleanse the sanctuary from human defilement, mostly. That's going to be important in just understanding the whole system. Then when you look at leprosy, it's important to pick that up, because other ancient people would have thought differently about this. Even though there's a lot of parallels in the way that they would have seen it, Israel is distinct in that way. They're not constantly supposed to live in fear of demonic forces and spooky sort of supernatural evil that could harm them at any moment. And I think there's some lessons there even just on that basic worldview framing of it for Christians to pay attention to. God does not say, the scriptures don't give us a picture where there is no supernatural realm that we should be concerned with. There very decisively is. But it's not for believers, it's not for God's people to go through life fearful of demonic spirits that can harm us. Right? There's a sort of balance there that you have to see what the text is doing, and it keeps you from that sort of fearful, constantly afraid approach of anything in the spiritual realm could harm me, so I better, right? Because what that leads to is a sort of magic approach. The ritual performs a magical purification that then sets me free from the fear of these spirits. That's not how it's working. That's a separate conversation for how do we engage with the supernatural realm and what is our interaction with the spiritual world. But that's a different conversation for a different time. It's just to say that these purification rituals and the offerings that are brought for atonement, they're not doing that particularly. So we should know that going in. So the thing to keep in mind when you get to sorting out some of the details, and chapter 13 and 14 of Leviticus have a tremendous amount of detail given just to this topic of what we're going to call skin disease, or it can happen also in a garment or on the walls of a house, a sort of mold that shows up on the house walls. The thing to keep in mind there is not sorting through, at least for this conversation, it's not sorting through all the medical details or the possible physical explanations for what could be going on here. Is it psoriasis? Is it house mold? Is it, right? That stuff we'll leave for other types of discussions. What I want us to focus on, what I find the most meaning in, is the symbolism of pure and impure. And then when you take that general approach to the symbolism and what's being laid out for the system of worship around the tabernacle and the priesthood, and apply it to the Leviticus engagement with something like leprosy, what sort of logic emerges? What is this actually? Why are we given so much information on this? And to keep it short and just give you a basic rundown, the overview of the symbolism is that no matter whether it's the dietary laws in chapter 11 or leprosy as we're looking at here, or things like blood, ritual blood, or menstrual blood, or chapter 15 is concerned with male seminal emissions. It's all any fluids that come out of the body reproductive fluids, or fluids that are released from the body and have anything to do with reproduction. All of that has around it a sort of logic that hinges on the symbolism of actually creation. So if you go back to the creation account, what you see emerge there reappears throughout these ritual purity laws. And that is, in a nutshell, life over death, wholeness versus sort of disintegration or incompleteness. So wholeness replaces incompleteness in the purity system, just as at creation, God made things whole, complete, and declared them good. And then the fall leads to things being disintegrated or disrupted in some way. And then related to that, in the creation account, you have God ordering things out of chaos. And then the fall brings a disorder back into reality. And so in the purity system, you have, in the same logic, you have a lot of concern for maintaining distinctions, that things would not be mixed together, that shouldn't be mixed together. There are boundaries set up, where if you have a breach or a transgression of boundaries, that's a disordering of things. It causes things to mix together that shouldn't mix together. And so there's a sort of logic to that. All of this is in some sense meant to fit into a broader narrative where what happens in the tabernacle system and the priesthood, what the priesthood is doing, is a return back to Eden, right? Where God had established life, created life and established order and built things with a completeness to them. At the fall, that gets disrupted. The tabernacle is a way to create an avenue for man, for humanity to come back to Eden in a symbolic sort of way. So the rituals have this logic to them: life over death, wholeness instead of a disunity, and order instead of chaos. And all that is a way to see a return to the Garden of Eden. We've talked about this before, so I won't belabor it here, but if you think of the closer you get to the presence of God in the tabernacle, you're heading west from the east. You're going closer to the Holy of Holies where God's glory is. If you think about that as not just an entrance in, but as an ascension up, think about the Holy of Holies being his throne, but think of it as sort of a heavenly throne. And then think of not just bringing offerings in, but ascending up to worship into the presence of God. You're going up a mountain. That is a return to Eden, and all the imagery would be consistent there. Bigger discussion than what we're going to do today, but just if you keep the logic of that in your mind, the system of purity and impurity starts to be a lot more, it makes more sense, and you understand what's going on in worship and ritual, and the purification that's going on here is a way of returning back to the presence of God, which is an ascension. So anyways, a lot to go into there, but just to get our feet under us, keep that in mind as we go into the details of leprosy and its symbolism. Because a lot of it's going to feed back into that overarching narrative of it's God's original creation order. Leprosy in particular really severely seems to disrupt that. Because why else would you give 2 full chapters to dealing with it in such arcane detail about how to go about dealing with this? So some of the symbolism of leprosy, just a couple of points on this. It basically, if a spot emerges on the skin, there's a combination of in the way it's described. It's the flesh showing through the skin. It's a sort of breaking down of the barrier of your skin, which is a covering, a boundary, if you will, that's breached by the flesh. And that's interesting. We'll come back to that. But essentially what happens with a positive diagnosis of what's called in Hebrew tzara'at, leprosy is the best translation we're going to do for now. We'll just stick with the word. But what happens when you see a positive diagnosis of leprosy, tzara'at appears, is it is essentially a sign that the flesh has become necrotic. It's decaying flesh. The seriousness of that is that it makes the leper a sort of living dead person. The symbolism is living death. The person is walking around, so he's alive, but he is bearing the marks of death. So Leviticus 13:45 actually sort of gives you a hint at this. The leprous person, the metzarah, as he's called, who has the disease, shall wear torn clothes and let the hair of his head hang loose. It's disheveled, is one translation. And he shall cover his upper lip and cry out, unclean, unclean. This is the ultimate social distancing. It's imposed on you. You have to do this. These are all ritual mourning practices. It's showing the mourning over a death is taking place, but the person who is the dead one is the one doing the mourning. Usually you mourn on behalf of those who are dead. Other people mourn for dead. Here, the dead person takes upon themselves the mourning rituals as if they're mourning their own death. You literally have them a walking dead person. They're walking around as a decaying corpse. That's the symbolism. Death of the flesh, which produces death, has broken through the skin, which is a protective barrier. And now you not only have that disorder, that transgression, that mixture of life and death, but you have literally this weird liminal state of not being quite one or the other. When you look at Numbers 12 in the story of Miriam, when Miriam is struck with leprosy for challenging Moses, Aaron intercedes and prays, actually appeals, I think, to Moses, Numbers 12, verse 12, "Let her not be as one dead, whose flesh is half eaten away when he comes out of his mother's womb." It's a really grim picture, kind of gruesome, actually. What Aaron is picking up there is a stillborn child is this horrifying and terrible combination of what should be a happy new birth, right? A new celebration of new life, but instead is this really morbid case of a corpse standing in front of you. What should be a new life being celebrated is somewhere, it looks like somewhere in between. The experience of a stillborn child is somewhere in between life and death. And that's a really horrifying picture. But that gives you a sense of some of the real terror of what it is to live with leprosy. It's to be in between life and death. It's a macabre reminder that life is infected with mortality. And in some sense, it may not even hint that it's may be better to just be fully dead than half dead, right? This is not a Princess Bride reference. It's not like mostly dead. This is like somewhere in between. You rather just be dead or alive, but here you are in this in-between state of living dead. And that's just really horrifying, actually, in the symbolism of it. So that's the main symbol of leprosy, is it's a walking dead person. It's living death, which is no life at all, but it's not even the simplicity and finality of just a death. It's something really in between that, which may be some of the reason why leprosy is so feared in the ancient world and why the text gives so much attention to it. It appears to be a spiritual condition much more than it's any kind of medical diagnosis. What I mean by that is it doesn't behave in a way, number one, that you can classify it medically, because diseases like this on the skin don't pop up on clothes. That doesn't make sense. It seems to be something imposed by God. We know that to be the case in several cases. When you look at the narratives in the Bible that deal with people who become leprous, most of them, Miriam, as we just mentioned, Gehazi in the king's account, and who else? You have King Uzziah. King Uzziah is one of the more famous ones. He's struck with leprosy after he breaches the sanctuary. All of those are supernaturally imposed. It's not that mysterious. That God strikes them with leprosy as a sort of punishment. Usually for the traditional Jewish view is for what they call lashon hara, the evil tongue, for speaking gossip or speaking wickedness in some way. But also it seems to be associated with pride, and maybe most specifically for violating something God has sanctified. So whether that's Moses or Uzziah goes into the sanctuary and performs the task he's not supposed to, or just touching holy things, you can be struck with leprosy. But there seems to be a supernatural cause of it, not simply a physical or medical disease. But in Leviticus, it's not actually clear that that's spelled out. God doesn't really point out that it's a punishment. If it appears, it's not really spelled out in Leviticus that that's a punishment. Now, chapter 14, Leviticus 14:34, he does talk about house leprosy as being something that when I put a case of tzara'at on a house. So at least in house leprosy, we do know God clearly says, I'm going to put it there. That reinforces the fact that it seems to be a supernatural plague, not just a physical ailment. But that doesn't prove that it's a punishment. What was he punishing the house for? There's some way to read this where he's putting it there for the Israelites to go in and take over Canaanite houses, and he's revealing something about the house as a warning to them. It's to help them. It's actually a sort of benefit to tell them, hey, you want to look in this spot and check it out and make sure you don't become defiled by it. So it could be a punishment. If leprosy pops up, you know you could be dealing with a punishment from God. We know that does happen. But there are other places you read about it and you think, I wonder if this is meant to be seen as more of a warning. God is warning me about something. And I think there's a good possibility that that's the case more often than not. There's an old, there's one Jewish interpretation of this, that the Canaanites would have known the Israelites were coming to take over, and they would have hidden their treasures and buried them in the walls. And so God would put the mark to tell the Israelites, here's where the treasure's buried. I think that takes it a little too far and gets kind of silly. But there's something around this idea that he's putting the spot there as a warning or an indicator that you should look here. There's something serious you need to pay attention to. So I think that's worth looking into and something we should come back to. A lot more detail worth looking into here, but I want to leave those details for further Bible study and different conversations. What would be the value of reading through ancient, really arcane, really obscure details like this in a text like Leviticus 13 and 14? What are Christians supposed to do with this? Let me pull out just a few lessons, a few sort of spiritual and almost discipleship lessons that I think we can take from this. Now, these require a little bit of imaginative reading, a little bit of, you'd have to work through the symbolism a little bit, which I've done. I'm not going to do through you in great detail here. But we should note just the basic approach of dealing with an infection. It pops up and you call for the priest, a high priest or one of his sons. Just the basic approach to this, I think, should help believers in understanding something. All sins, all sinful acts are in themselves defiling, but all defilement is not caused by sin. Okay, so what I mean by that is there is a lesson for pastoral ministry, for counseling, and for just holding one another accountable as brothers and sisters in Christ. If somebody is engaged in sinful activity, that will defile the church. That will bring impurity, and we will all bear consequences for that. But not everything that defiles is necessarily sinful and should be treated the same way. Now, this is tricky. We don't want to allow defilement into the church. But we have to be careful to examine closely whether something is actually a sin, right? Whether it's a real moral or spiritual sin that is causing defilement, or is it maybe just the flesh popping up, shining through in a way that could turn into a defilement? You want to be careful about how that gets examined. You have to do this kind of examination of what's potentially defiling with a mind to the well-being of the person being examined, right? They come to the priest, they can't just be immediately declared unclean and kicked out. They have to be closely examined for their own well-being and for the sake of getting at an accurate diagnosis. So you could think of this in terms of, one example that came to my mind is Paul writes 1 Corinthians 5 about a person who is defiling the church through their immoral behavior. And he says, you need to kick them out. You need to purge that evil out from your midst. Right? That's leprosy. That's full-scale That's really harmful. That is death in your congregation. You need to get rid of it. That is a breach of the created order. It's not good. You can't accept it. But then he writes in 2 Corinthians about the same person whom they have dealt with, however they dealt with him. They properly dealt with him, but taking Paul's advice. And he says, the pain that was inflicted because of the action that was taken against that person who was living immorally, the punishment inflicted by the congregation, it seems he actually repented and was restored to fellowship, which was the goal of taking extreme action and disciplining him. It seems that works. And Paul says, since that seems to be the case, you should rather let him return and forgive such a one and comfort him, lest he be, I'm reading from 2 Corinthians 2 here, verse 7. You should rather turn and forgive and comfort him, or he may be overwhelmed by excessive sorrow. There's a case there that, yes, a defilement popped up, and yes, it was serious, and it had to be distanced from the congregation. But it can be remedied. It can be purified. And if appropriate steps are taken, then you ought to take care that the person is now cared for, not driven to excessive sorrow. So he says you should reaffirm your love for him and test whether you're being obedient in everything. It's not a case where you can just notice that another brother or sister is potentially going to contribute something we consider to be impure to the congregation, and therefore we've got to really come down hard on them. It's got to be more carefully examined than that. So there's a lesson built into there that I think if you're reading Leviticus carefully, you can take something like that away from it. Another thing, and this is quite apropos in the state that we're all sort of living with, a sort of isolation from each other, is that these concerns were concerns for the congregation, for the community. They were corporate concerns as much as they were for the individual who had a mark on his skin pop up. Christians tend to think of sin, like we think of salvation, mostly as an abstract spiritual concept, and mostly or largely individualistically, rather than as a communal participatory thing and as a real life infection, right? Sin is not just an abstract spiritual principle. It is sort of personified in real life behaviors, thoughts, and actions in a way that we really should be open to account for more. The Bible presents this type of problem as both an individual one and a communal one. It affects everybody if it's allowed to affect everybody. And we should take that a little bit more seriously just in the way we do church. So you can think of Paul writing to the church and telling them in 1 Corinthians 3 that you are God's temple. You all are God's temple, and the Spirit dwells in you. And if anyone destroys God's temple, God will destroy him. You can see some interaction here where, why do we have to put that guy out? Because if he gets in here, the whole corporate access to God's presence could be threatened. That's very much the concern in Leviticus and the whole tabernacle system. And the New Testament will carry those principles over into the church life to say, God's temple is holy, and therefore you ought to have this corporate concern for holiness that a lot of times Christians, in the way we do theology, we don't really account for that. My salvation is mine. My discipleship is mine. My holiness is my own business, and sanctification I'll do on my own. Thank you very much. It doesn't work that way. It's not supposed to work that way. So there's a sort of communal living that you see in Leviticus, a communal concern that the church ought to be a lot more aware of. And that's a lesson we can take from Leviticus in this section on leprosy for sure. Is the infection fading? Priest goes and examines, and he's not sure. So what does he do? The man has to quarantine for 7 days. He'll be back in 7 days. I'll check it out again. There's a sort of caution about this. When he comes back after 7 days, it's like, it's not getting any worse. Seems to be fading. It's good. It doesn't look good, but it's not going to defile all of us. So you're all right. Or is it spreading? Is it deeper than the skin? Is it spreading? Is it malignant? Is it growing? We ought to start to think about, again, sins, defilement, false teaching, immorality, unethical behavior. We ought to think about all this in the same realm. Anyone can have an outburst of the flesh. Our flesh will always pop up through the skin sometimes. We need to be priests to each other and examine, all right, well, what do we do with this? Maybe just cool off for a while, right? If the sin is anger, maybe talk to a brother and get it under control. If we're just overcome with anxiety, that's not a sin in itself. But could anxiety turn into the type of fear that infects a congregation? Sure. And if that gets malignant, you've got to deal with it more aggressively. But for now, maybe we just take a cooling off period. Maybe we just take a break, sit alone with the Lord, and see if he'll purge us of it before it becomes a problem. See if it might not be deeper than the skin. If it is, though, we need to deal with it. So there are things like this we got to think through in church. And there are deep lessons like this embedded in Leviticus that we can learn from. There are, I think, a few different ways we could go even deeper with this. This would require way too much time and energy to get into with what we have time for today. Let me close with this one. There is a curious way that the language of this skin affliction gets described. Someone doesn't contract leprosy in Leviticus, in the Bible generally. The language is sara'at naga. Someone is struck with leprosy or plagued by leprosy, or you could just think of touched with leprosy. Where does the touch come from? This is why we argue, most scholars will, and I concur. It's a spiritual infection. It doesn't just arise necessarily as a medical condition. You're struck with leprosy. The language there is interesting. One place it's most interesting to me, and there's a lot more we could do with this, but look at Isaiah 53. Verse 4 reads this: "Surely our griefs he himself bore, and our sorrows he carried. Yet we ourselves esteemed him stricken," naga. That's the term that a leper would also be stricken. He was stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. Verse 8, if you skip ahead, talking again about the servant. "By oppression and judgment he was taken away. And as for his generation, who considered that he was cut off out of the land of the living?" He was no longer among the living, which of course in the context probably means he was killed. But the language says he was taken away from the living. He's not allowed into the land where life resides. Think of the tabernacle. Think of the presence of God in the tabernacle. That's where life is in the symbolism. And the leper is cast outside the community, outside the gates, outside the barrier. "And he's cut off out of the land of the living for the transgression of my people, to whom the stroke," or the plague, "was actually due." It's the same word there. It's the noun form of stricken. The people who should have been rightfully stricken with this affliction, someone else came and bore it for them. He was stricken by God. He was afflicted with this plague on behalf of those who actually should have deserved it, who actually earned such a punishment. Obviously, this is read in terms of a messianic reference to Jesus, who bears our wounds, who bears our afflictions. But in the language of Isaiah, there is some way you can read this where you see the servant here, whom we would know as the Messiah, as taking on the characteristics of a leper. He becomes a sort of leper Messiah, a living dead, an afflicted person who bears the strike, the plague of leprosy that we well deserved, right? Because what is leprosy? It's a manifestation of the flesh erupting out and overtaking our healthy life by introducing death life, right? Necrotic life, decaying life. You can in a very real sense see Jesus as becoming a leper in our place. We are the living dead. We are the walking dead. We are all sort of walking around lepers in our sin and defilement. But Jesus comes and he absorbs it. He sort of takes the touch of God on himself. What's due to us, he bears himself. He is the leper Messiah who absorbs our impurity and brings us new life. He's cast outside the gate, as it were, outside the land of the living, so that we can be brought into God's presence. Quite a beautiful picture that emerges. And there are other ways you can read this symbolically, and see that Leviticus is offering a lot more than an ancient medical examination. The ritual here is powerful in the symbolism, and the messianic implications and the sort of church life, the moral and ethical and spiritual implications are actually considerable, actually really worth digging into. So I'll leave you with that. I have a lot more we could say about this, and I hope some of your reading will bear some fruit. And if you have more questions that pop up, I've certainly got more to talk about here. But I wanted to just give you some things to chew on with the section of reading that we had this week. I know it's a lot to read, and I know it's not the most exhilarating thing to read through. But a deep reading like this and some careful and measured consideration for the symbolic elements, I think will really pay off in a lot of ways. So hopefully there's something for you there to think about. Hopefully this is sharpening a little bit in some ways and sparks your interest to get deeper into the text. If you have thoughts, certainly if you have questions, there's a lot that needs explained that I admittedly did not explain. Send them to me, put them in the comments. Love to engage on those things if you're at all interested or you have ideas that come to you. I really love hearing your thoughts. Meanwhile, we will see you next time when we get into the Day of Atonement ritual in Leviticus 16. Until then, may the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. May the Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. Shalom.